Hi, friends. How are you today? I'm Heather, and I'm the host of Brewing Murder and Mystery. I am so glad that you're here, and I am now on Spotify. If you're on Spotify listening, I am on YouTube. And of course, you can follow me at my IG account at the same name. I'm so glad to be here. I am annoyed with my hair because it is so staticky and it's like clinging to the sides of my face. But what are you going to do? These are those moments where I feel like if I was going to chop it all off, I'd do it now, but I'm trying to just wait out this weather. So, guess I won't be chopping off my hair today, but there goes. If you're listening to the podcast, you can't even see it. But if you are watching on YouTube, see, this is annoying. Oh, I'm even whacking the microphone while I'm trying to get my hair to. Anyways, all right, I'm going to try to limit my disgust with my hair right now because we have got a case today that I am going to just probably say wow a lot and oh my goodness a lot and yikes a lot because it's just one of those at every turn you're like, oh, and there's more. Oh, okay, all right. So, so but good news is the last two episodes I did were about kids and this one is not. So, yay! If there's a silver lining in the case, that would be it. That would be the silver lining for today. So, thank you so much for being here. Let's jump into this, shall we? Have you guys heard of Gary Heidnik? Heidnik? I believe that's right. If you haven't, well, sit down and buckle up, buddy, because this is a doozy. Get your cup of coffee and oh, see, I'm already shrugging because I'm like shrugging. I mean shivering. I'm already shivering because I know what's ahead, what's in store for us today. And it all started back in November 22nd of 1943 in Eastlake, Ohio, which is a suburb of Cleveland. So Gary is the oldest of two boys. He has a younger brother, Terry, and his mom, Ellen, and his dad, Michael, divorced when Gary was about 3 years old. And for the first 4 years of the divorce, the boys are going to be living with their mom, Ellen, but she has an alcohol problem. So she just really can't take care of the boys. And for the next 7 years, they end up moving in with their dad, who's already remarried. And the boys did not like their stepmom. It's said that any chance and opportunity they got to kind of drive a wedge between the couple, they took, and their dad, Michael, was not for it. He didn't care. It was like she could do no wrong and they could do everything wrong. So these boys were apparently very abused by their father. So these allegations of abuse consisted of things like, physical and mental abuse. And Michael was asked about it later on, but before he died, he just stuck to his guns that he had never done any of this abuse. Although Terry went on record in an interview saying that Gary and Terry were both abused, and he believes it's a lot of the problems that Gary ends up having. One of the things that a lot of young children have is the bedwetting problem. And there are those children who end up having it longer than most. Well, that was Gary. And whenever Michael would see that Gary wet the bed, he would just be livid. He would see red. And his attempt at getting the problem to stop was making Gary wash his sheets, but then hanging them from his bedroom window so the entire neighborhood could see these sheets. So basically, it was his way of shaming him to not do it anymore. But clearly that didn't work because it wasn't just a matter of will. He actually couldn't control it. The crazy thing was the bed sheets were not the only thing that hung out the window. According to even some neighbors, Michael would hold Gary out the window by his feet while yelling all of his discrepancies against Gary. So basically, the whole neighborhood could hear why Gary was in trouble. And it just makes you think, like, where was CPS at this moment, right? Like, nobody did anything about it. But I guess 1943, it was kind of one of those, you just don't look, you don't tell, and you just mind your own business. But Michael was making sure that everybody in the neighborhood knew Gary's business. And another thing that he would do was basically beat the children and also decide when they could or could not eat. And there we go again on this reoccurring theme that whoever is in control has control of the food. And therefore, until the boys repented to Michael's standards, they would not eat. And it always had to be when Michael felt like they had been punished enough or repented enough. It was a pretty rough home life for the two boys. And boys will be boys, and they would go out and climb trees. And one time, Gary was climbing a tree and he ended up falling out of it. Now, this fall was so bad that his head was actually misshapen. And of course, the second I heard this, I was like, you don't say frontal lobe damage? That seems to also be something we hear over and over again. He goes to school. He's already having problems. He's like antisocial. He's one of those boys that kind of like keeps his head down, won't make eye contact with other kids. And now he has a misshapen head. As you can imagine, school was brutal. Home was brutal. School was brutal. Despite all of his problems with school, though, he actually did really well academically. He had an IQ of 130 to 148, which means he was pretty smart. The average IQ is between 85 and 115. At the age of 17, Gary drops out of high school and joins up with the United States Army. And he's really hoping to get into like a really important position, whether that be like the military police or weapons specialist. But unfortunately, he was rejected, which is kind of interesting considering that while he was in basic boot camp, his sergeant graded him excellent on his paperwork. I'm not really sure why he got such an excellent ranking, but for whatever reason, he wasn't fit to go into the field that he wanted. He was then sent to San Antonio, Texas. He got training in to be a medic. He did rather well in medics training, and then they sent him off to work in the 46th Army Surgical Hospital in Western Germany. If you know anything about the medical field, it's pretty intense. I don't know what it was back then, but I'm assuming it was still a lot of study, a lot of learning. And he gets sent over to Germany, learning the medical stuff, and he manages to get his GED in just a matter of a few weeks of being over in Germany. It kind of shows you his drive and determination that when he wants something, he's really going to be able to accomplish it. It's like, hey, kudos to Gary on that. In August of 1962, Gary started complaining about severe headaches and dizziness and blurry vision and even nausea. He was diagnosed with, hold on, let me try to figure out how to say this, gastroenteritis, gastroenteritis. It's a fancy name for infectious diarrhea. Gross. The doctors noticed while he was in there, though, that he was also showing signs of a mental illness, and he was actually prescribed medication for schizophrenia. He takes a huge jump, which I'm assuming that a lot of this had to do with his fall, because yikes. Moving to Philadelphia in October of 1962, Gary started working in a mental hospital, and he basically ends up being a patient there himself. And he ends up being a patient there even more so than he actually does any work there. He ends up getting honorably discharged from the military and diagnosed with schizoid personality disorder. And so this all happened in a 13-month window from the time that he leaves to go to into the service to the time that he's discharged. So this is a very, very quick turnaround. Gary attempts to take his own life several times while he's in a mental institution, but is unsuccessful. To be noted that his mom actually committed suicide during this time period too. Some reports said that she was in a really abusive relationship and she felt like there was no way out of it. But I found another report that said that she was diagnosed with bone cancer from her alcoholism and that the thought process was she committed suicide because she didn't want to die horrifically with bone cancer. Either way, it's still really, really tragic. And I'm not sure if Gary was close to his mom at this time, but I mean, it's your mom. Chances are it still affected him. Also, Terry would eventually do some time in a mental institution himself and attempt suicide. So they all really needed some serious help. Deciding to go back to school shortly after his discharge, Gary became a licensed practical nurse and he enrolled in the University of Pennsylvania. But this only lasted a semester and he got a job at a veterans hospital. But that career did not last very long because Gary was said to be very aggressive and would yell at the patients if he even bothered showing up at all. So, when you don't have a job and you have no future prospects and you need some money, what's a man to do? Well, Heidnik incorporated the United Church of the Ministers of God in October of 1971. Yeah, he started a church. And apparently, he had 5 followers too. Now, just a side note that if you do come across the United Church of the Ministers of God, that is an actual church that is not associated with this event. So just be warned that it's not like if you run into somebody, you're like, you're Gary's crazy cult church. Because not the same thing. I just wanted to throw that out there. But yeah, so he had 5 followers, which is kind of a lot of followers, I think, to start a church. I mean, that's about as many subscribers as I had. So, yay, Gary. But the neighbor said that although the followers of Gary's church would show up every single Sunday, they were all pretty much on the mentally ill side of things. Which is really just sad because it seemed like he was just taking advantage of anybody with a lower IQ than him, or frankly, a lower IQ than the average Joe. And he would end up raising quite a bit of money from this endeavor. So these poor mentally ill patients, or mentally ill, or mentally handicapped, or whichever way you want to look at it, congregation was pretty much handing over their checks to Gary. And to be noted at this time also that Gary was still making suicide attempts. So when he had to be hospitalized, he would just tell his followers that he was on sabbatical or that he was away doing missionary work, and they would continue on with church even without his presence. During this time, Gary made a point to be able to meet and date women, though. So there's that. This is where he met Gail, and she became pregnant with his son, Gary Jr. Now, Gail was also on the mentally ill spectrum or mental capacity and lost custody of their child shortly after his birth because it was just said that she wasn't fit to take care of their child. With no baby, I guess Gail was just not the girl for Gary and he moved on rather quickly. He ended up meeting a girl named Anjanette who had an IQ of only 48. She was illiterate and mentally disabled. So when she became pregnant and gave birth to their daughter, Maxine was also immediately taken into foster care. So this is the pattern so far. He keeps getting women pregnant who are incapable of taking care of their children, which makes you think, did these women even know they were getting themselves into relationships? I don't know. Now, Anjanette had a sister, and her name was Alberta, and she was living in an institution for the mentally disabled. Gary actually met Anjanette in the same hospital when he was stationed there. So, seems to be his dating grounds, but he decides that he's going to check Alberta, Anjanette's sister, out of a mental institution for a day pass. He brings her back to the house that him and Anjanette share together. He decides to keep Alberta there for 10 days, in which she is repeatedly raped, sodomized, and tortured. Why didn't Anjanette do anything, you might be thinking? Well, Anjanette was mentally ill herself, and I'm not even sure if she understood what was going on, let alone knew how to stop it. He's just a monster taking advantage of these poor girls. And really, it's just mind boggling that he was even able to get away with this. Now, I don't know about other people that check mentally disturbed patients out for a day pass. They probably take them to the movies or out to eat or shopping, and then they bring them back. But when Alberta didn't come back that afternoon, nobody went looking for her, which makes you wonder, like, where were the doctors and nurses when they came around to her room for her like medications schedule? Where they just like, oh, she's not here, and just turned around and walked off? I don't know. But by the time the police were notified, it had already been 10 days, and Alberta had just been being taken advantage this entire time. When the police found Alberta, she was covered in blood and just terrified from the whole ordeal. I mean, clearly that would be traumatic for anybody, which is completely understandable. And then to maybe not even have the mental capacity to even understand what's going on to you, eek, it would just be awful. Gary was charged with kidnapping, rape, unlawful resistance, false imprisonment, involuntary, deviant sexual intercourse, and interfering with the custody of a committed person. Oh, you'd think this would be like rap sheet. You're going away for a long time. Throw away the key. Bye, Felicia. But no. Like, what is up with these guys getting off the hook so easily? His original sentence is overturned by appeal. And then the rest of it is just 3 years in a mental institution. That's where he's meeting girls in the first place. It doesn't seem like a very good consequence or penalty for somebody like that. So he was released in 1983, and then he meets Betty Disco. She was from the Philippines, and some sources say that she was a mail order bride, but basically Gary and Betty are exchanging letters through the mail for about 2 years when he basically tells her that he would like to marry her and have her come over. In 1985, in September, she flies on over and they quickly get married in October. But the marriage rapidly goes on a decline fast. Not only is Gary getting really aggressive sexually with her and basically raping her, she comes home one day to find Gary in bed with another woman. Now, livid when she goes to leave, he basically beats her and tells her she's not allowed to leave and that if she tries, he will kill her. She's terrified. She's isolated. She's alone. She has no friends, no family. And her new husband is insane. And then he pushes her far enough where not only is she expected to watch him have relations with other women, he wants her to participate. She's very unhappy, clearly, and she eventually finds help with the Filipino community and is able to escape back home. Now, at the time of her escape, she was pregnant. She knew she was pregnant, but she kept it secret or kept it quiet because she didn't want Gary to find out, because she just felt like as soon as he knows, she would never be able to figure out how to escape. Of course, after she takes off, Gary is livid to find out that she has taken off and she's with child. Later on, Betty ends up filing against her husband and he is arrested and charged with assault, spousal rape, and involuntary deviant sexual intercourse. But there's no record of the incarceration for this, which is, I'm assuming, Betty was out of the country and so she couldn't show up for his hearing or whatnot, so the charges were just dropped. 6 months after, she has a baby boy and names him Jesse John. Now, 2 months after Jesse John is born, Gary goes out and he's back on track. He wants to find those sexual partners. And by sexual partners, I mean victims. Lucky him, he lives in an area where there is a lot of sex workers, which is where I'm assuming that these women were coming from because I don't know any women, and I'm not saying they're not out there, but I don't know any women who are on board with coming home to your house to let your wife watch. Usually women are not up to for doing that. Maybe okay, moving I'm not going to go there. Moving on. He ends up finding his first, I guess I can't say first victim because this is clearly not his first victim. He ends up getting his first prisoner. There we go. No, I guess I can't say that either because Alberta was, well, he ends up coming across Josefina Riviera, and she's 25 and heavily, heavily addicted to drugs. She has lost her children already to the system, and she's on the streets prostituting herself to keep that going. It's one of those common sad stories that we hear about all the time. Gary picks her up, takes her back to his place. They engage in sexual activities. And then, as she's about to get dressed, he strangles her until she passes out. She comes to and she's being dragged down the stairs of his basement. She's not even fully dressed. This was like a dirt cellar type basement. So it's freezing cold and it's just awful. I mean, that scenario would just be awful. He chains her up. I guess he even puts like super glue in the little bolt holes so that these like chains are sealed. I don't know how. I guess they were just permanently on there. I'm not sure. And she's later on stated that the basement was freezing cold, just freezing cold. Not only is this like basement dirty and grungy and dark, Gary had already started digging this like hole in the ground, which is later known to be the pit. He was going to put girls in it and cover it up. And then, like, I don't know what the point of it was except to be awful and horrible and maybe sound protection. I don't know. But this pit was not very big at the time. So Josephina gets kind of like smashed into it. And as Gary's putting plywood across the top of it, he's just repeatedly bashing her in the head because she doesn't fit in there. That's really what happened. So he finally gets her in there, and the poor girl is left in this pit hole for 3 days. And then she hears Gary arriving, but he has another girl with him. This other girl's name is Sandra. She's 24 years old. And Josephina said that when she met Sandra, she knew right away that Sandra was mentally disabled. So she asks Sandra, saying, like, hey, how did he get you? To which she responds that she was on her way home from basically a local store, kind of gave me the impression of like a gas station that sells some things. And she wasn't even that far from home. Gary offers to give her a ride and she accepts. And as soon as she gets into the car, he strangles her and she passes out. And then the same thing as Josephina, she kind of wakes up as he's dragging her down the basement. And again, she is also chained up and glue in the little bolt holes. And it's just awful. And on top of that, now he's got these two women and he decides to have his way with them and forces them to watch while he's doing it to the opposite and vice versa. that would just be horrible. Next, he goes out and he finds a girl named Lisa Thomas. Now, Lisa Thomas is 19 years old, and when she was kidnapped and joined this nightmarish basement of horrors, the same thing happens to her as Josephina and Sandra. And then again on New Year's Day, Gary brings home Deborah. Deborah's 23 years old and was considered the more confrontational one. Like, she just wouldn't put up with Gary, and like she spit in his face and it's like, yeah, you go, girl. Like, this guy is horrible. But kind of the way that she starts getting after Gary actually has him improve on how he treats the other girls. Up until this point, first of all, let me backtrack just a smidgen so you understand the timeline. Josephina was taken on the 25th of November, which ended up being the day before Thanksgiving that year. There's no toilet down there. They're not allowed to have any feminine products, and they hadn't bathed. So this is Thanksgiving to New Year's Day. Well, because of Deborah and her outbursts and the way that she treats Gary, he brings in a portable toilet, he gives them feminine care products, and the girls are actually allowed to bathe for the first time in months. I guess you could say that was a win. So the final girl that would be brought into the House of Horrors at this time would be Jacqueline. Now she's the youngest girl at just 18, and she was taken on January 18th. The girls said that Gary was very unpredictable and you never knew the way he was going to be, like when he came down the stairs. Kind of like that Mr. Jackal and Mr. Hyde scenario. They didn't know if he was going to be pleasant. They didn't know if he was going to be angry or whatnot. And he was very abusive. And the girls, it was really dangerous for them to disobey Gary. Basically, if they disobeyed Gary, they would get beaten profusely, they wouldn't be fed, and they would be raped or just tortured, just even worse than that. I guess part of me is like, what? They're already being tortured. What's worse than that? But we'll get there. We'll get there. Gary ends up figuring out that the girls can hear him coming and going, and he doesn't like this idea. Now, he thinks as soon as they hear him leave, that gives them the opportunity to be loud, try to scream for neighbors, try to escape, because there's no fear of Gary hearing them. He decides in his brilliant brain with his large IQ that he's going to take care of this so that they won't be able to escape. Now, this is pretty horrific, so be warned. But he comes down and he duct tapes all the girls' mouths shut. And then he takes a screwdriver and punctures their eardrums so that they cannot hear him coming and going anymore. And I just cringe. I just cringe about this. I don't even like my ears being touched. I don't like them being breathed on. And to sit there and think that you would have this done to not only one ear, but both ears, and you would watch girls have this happen to them and then know that you're like in the lineup for this that's a traumatizing idea all on its own. And so I just, it just makes me shiver thinking about this. And oh my goodness, how sickening, like how sickening. So after this horrific event, Sandra does something wrong. She probably did something wrong every day, according to Gary, but this was like a no scenario. So she gets put in the pit. And when Gary goes upstairs, Sandra tries to escape and Gary finds out. So he's just livid with her. So he decides to like shackle her to a beam, or maybe it's like a plumbing pipe that's kind of on the roof of the basement. But she's basically shackled to this beam where all of the weight is resting on her wrists and her feet are barely able to touch the ground. So she's not able to get any kind of relief from like pushing herself up. She's not allowed to sit. And if that's not punishment enough, Gary decides she's not even allowed to be fed at this point. And the other girls couldn't help her either because they were also chained up. Now, not severe like her, they were just chained up to where they couldn't get to her. So, no food, no water. And finally, after one whole week of this, Gary decides that she's had enough of a punishment. So, he's going to come down and he's going to feed her and unchain her. But when he does so, her body literally just flops to the ground. She's dead. And I guess Gary didn't think that through. So he kind of kicks at her and determines that she's no longer alive. Now, he's got a real conundrum on his hands because this is his first murder victim. And he didn't bring these girls down to kill them. This wasn't part of the plan. But now that it's happened, you just got to move on. And he's a fly by a seat kind of guy. So he advises a plan to dismember her body. So he drags her upstairs, but then decides that he needs two of the girls. We don't know which two, but they're going to help. He convinces these two girls that they have to help because if they don't, if her body gets found, like if he goes and he puts her out somewhere and somebody discovers her and then they trace it back to him, they're also going to go to jail as accomplices. So once he's got the body up there, he uses a power saw. He starts to dismember her, and the girls are helping. They end up cutting out her ribs and they place them in the oven and cook them. They put her arms and her legs in the freezer and her head in a pot on the stove. And he cooks her head and her ribs. Now, ugh, like, I, mm, I have no words. I have no words. But the smell is so potent that some of Gary's neighbors start to actually complain. And it's said that they could not handle the smell to the point that people were not even eating their own food in their own house because of how horrific this smell is. One neighbor calls the police because he or she, it doesn't say who, is just fed up with this. And once the police arrive, Gary says that he burnt a roast and the police leave. Now, are you thinking what I'm thinking? Because every documentary, sorry, words are very hard for me today. Every true crime show, podcast that I have seen where somebody smells a dead body, they are always saying how, like, you can pinpoint it. What's the word I'm thinking? Like, distinct. How distinct a dead body smells that you just know. Were these cops rookies or something? Because I know they didn't go in there and be like, oh, yeah, that smells like roast, right? And if they would have done any kind of background check on this guy, they would have already seen his rap sheet. That's also infuriating because they would have found a head, a head on the stove and ribs in the oven and girls in a basement. Like, I don't know what to do with that information. But it seems like there's always a situation out there where these bad guys are this close. This close. I'm putting my fingers together really small if you're listening on the podcast. This close. And it's like no cigar, right? The police leave, and Gary decides that he's going to feed Sandra to his dogs and take some of the meat, grind it up into dog food, and then he's going to feed that to the girls. And it was very, you eat this dog food mixture or you starve to death. All these poor women are now being forced to be cannibals. Now, Deborah, who was that spunky one I told you about, well, she gets herself into trouble, which is not really any surprise because Gary does not like to put up with women. He thinks they're all beneath him. He thinks that they're just his for the taking and using and destroying and dumping. So Deborah pushes Sassy too far and she gets put into the pit. Now, at this time, one of the torture devices or torture, what am I trying to think of? My brain is really not working today. I apologize. One of Gary's way of torturing the women is that he has now filled the pit with water and he has stripped down some electrical wires and he sticks it into the water so that when he flips the switch, the girls are being electrocuted. I kid you not. And he's doing the switch and Deborah stops making noises. And he just assumes that his electricity is no longer working. But no, Deborah had died from being electrocuted. And I just think, like, why is this guy, his IQ is so high, but he is so dumb. He actually didn't think that this would happen. Deborah is now deceased and murdered. I shouldn't even say deceased. Is now murdered by Gary. And I think that his dismemberment of Sandra was just kind of either it was too much work or it just put a bad taste in his mouth because he decides with Deborah he's just gonna get rid of her. He just takes her out somewhere and dumps the body. That was easy peasy, I guess. So he's lost two girls and he decides that he needs to go abduct another girl. So he abducts Agnes on March 23rd, 1987. And he knows her because she's a local. She's 24 and she's a local sex worker. I forgot to mention that at some point in this, Gary has told all the girls that he basically wants to kidnap 10 women, impregnate them all, and have a baby farm. Because yes, this guy needs children on top of all of this. That's a terrifying thought. So he goes and he gets Agnes, and she doesn't really think anything different because they had actually done business before. And when he brings her home, he strangles her. Bada bing, bada boom. Same thing. She's thrown down the stairs, dragged down the stairs, and handcuffed. And now she is a new part of this house of horrors. I'll have you know that while this is all going on, his church is still actively running with multiple members at this time. Like was at least 10 members because it had doubled within the first year. And that was before like any of these girls were taken. So originally it said that this church met in the basement. I'm not sure if they were continuing to meet at the basement at this time or if because now that there's girls down there, they're meeting upstairs, or if all these girls were just kind of forced into the pit. But there's not really much information. Like the police never pressed charges against anybody in the church because there was no proof that they even knew what was going on. And with their mental disabilities, they might have seen things and just not known what it was. That was kind of another unfortunate thing. At this time, Josephina, who had been there the longest, was finally starting to really figure out Gary. And she was really trying to determine if there was a way for her to be able to escape this and not only just escape for herself, but for the girls too. So she kind of figures out Gary. She realizes that he's a really lonely guy and he really wants connection. Of course, he's doing it in all of the worst ways possible, but she does see that he has a soft spot and he actually does want like a family. So she starts playing into his vulnerabilities and she starts to like really treat him well. And when he makes suggestions and things, she's always like boasting his confidence. And he even goes on to leave her in charge of the other girls. And when he would come back, she would report to him. And if any of the girls had done something that Gary didn't like, then he would have Josephina beat the girls for him. Now, I don't know how you feel about that, if you would be able to do that yourself or not on survival mode. But it was basically determined that if Josephina didn't do a beating up to Gary's standard, then he would just turn around and beat her. That's a really rough spot to be in, but she had a goal. She had a goal in mind, so she was focused. She was trying to be brave and she was trying to be focused. He eventually lets her come upstairs and they have some meals together and they're watching TV together. And it was even said that at one point he even took her to some of the local like fast food restaurants. And when questioned on why she didn't just run off, like, especially when she was out in public, she could have just taken off. She said that she knew if she ran off that Gary would most likely just go home and kill the other girls because he didn't want to get caught having them. So she really did have these other girls' survival in mind too, and she wanted them to all be rescued and all make it out of there alive. But one of these attempts, Josephina actually convinces Gary that he needs to let her say goodbye to her family. And that if she can just go quickly say goodbye to her family, she can come back and they can just live their little baby farm dreams. And she had already proven herself to be faithful to him. I guess there was a couple of times where he tried to get her to help lure in new victims. It didn't sound like it was successful, so she was probably playing along, but There's no actual accounts of her getting any victims, but so he's trusting her at this point. Like she's doing everything, she's being his like little minion. Gary didn't really question it. And she said like, "Look, I really need to go do this alone because if you come with me, then they could identify you. And you really shouldn't park out in front of the house because then they could identify a vehicle. And I need to make them really think that I'm doing this by myself." And Gary just kind of really buys into it and really, really thinks that this is a good idea. So they park at a close gas station. And Gary's like, "You have 15 minutes or else." And she's just kind of playing along, like, "Okay, bye, Gary." And then she kind of walks off. And as soon as she's out of sight, she just like scurries off. Now, thankfully, since this is her neighborhood and she knows people around, the closest person was her ex boyfriend. So she's like knocking on his door, and thankfully he's home. She runs in and she's like telling him everything that had been happening and where she'd been. And her ex boyfriend really wanted to go confront Gary, but she's like, "No, don't do that. We need to call the police." And thankfully, he agrees with her. So they call the police. Luckily, there was a squad car in the local region, and they show up. And the officer, or the responding officer, actually noted in his notes that she had chain markings on her legs. So this helped them like get convinced that this story was real and that she wasn't just like making up things and so on and so on. And she tells them like they have got to arrest Gary right away because if he is allowed to go home, there's a huge chance that he is going to kill the other women. Thankfully, after all of this time, Gary is arrested in his car at the gas station. It's like, woo, round of applause, finally. The police show up to the house and just say it is disgusting, and they're all like sickened by it. And I'm talking about the state of the actual house, just the filth and the smell, and just gross, like gross. It didn't say anything about him being like a hoarder or anything, but it gave me those vibes like dirty hoarder house like vibes when I was reading this. And then of course when they went down to the basement, they find the other girls and they're just filthy and they smell, and it was just, the police said it was just sickening, like they were all literally sick from it. So the remaining girls, Lisa, Jacqueline, and Agnes, are finally rescued. And some of these girls had been captive for up to 4 whole months. What a relief for them to finally see police and know that they're going to get out of there. These women were finally free. Gary was going to shoot for the insanity plea, which you almost think that he could get with all of his mental illness situations, but thankfully that was shot down. July 1988 he was sentenced to death. And the following January he attempted to kill himself, which was a failure, and that would have been his 13th attempt at suicide in his entire life. Surprisingly, though, his family, Betty, the ex wife, and his daughter, Maxine, filed a suit saying that he was not competent enough for execution. But on July 3rd, 1999, the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania issued its final ruling, clearing the way for Heidnik's execution. It was kind of interesting for me to see that Betty and his daughter came because Betty didn't like him and didn't want anything to do with him. And as far as we know, his daughter had nothing to do with him at all. So that was kind of interesting that they were there at the end. But who knows? Maybe there was stuff going on we didn't even know about. His final meal was 2 slices of cheese pizza and a black coffee. Probably not what I would choose, but I mean, I guess that's not a big deal to me. I, I don't think he deserves 2 slices of pizza and a coffee, so but that's what he ate. And on July 6th, 1999, he was executed by lethal injection and his body was cremated. That's the horrific story of Gary Heidnik. Now, if this sounds familiar to you, it might be because author Thomas Harris used 6 real life murders to write the character of Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs. There is another movie. I can't remember what the name of it is at this exact moment, but it has John Cusack in it. John Cusack. And I know there's like a pit with like water and the guy kidnaps a bunch of girls. I should look that up. I haven't seen it in a while. But that movie sounds a lot like this too. Out of all of the victims, they kind of spoke out against Gary, but Josephina was the most vocal to speak out and she just really helped in the trial. But the unfortunate thing was the media painted her to be like Gary's sidekick. And I just can't imagine going through that kind of hell and then the media paints you to be a bad guy. I didn't like that at all. But Josephina did end up writing a book and it's called Cellar Girls. And if you want to read about that, it's all about her experience. Luckily, she ends up having a happy ending, I would say, because she ended up getting remarried. She made connections with her children that had got taken away from CPS. She's a grandmother now, and she said she lives by the sea and she feels at peace, but she does still suffer with nightmares, which is totally understandable. I don't know about the other girls, but I hope that they found peace and I hope that they're doing well because like how do you go back to life after that? It's just it's just sad and horrific and I really hope that they found peace. And if they're still around, they still have peace. But yeah, so what do you think? Are you for the death penalty? Are you against the death penalty? What do you think about the police? Like tell me what your thoughts are. Tell me what you would do. And would you be a Josephina or a poor Deborah? Because I'd be sassy. I probably wouldn't have made it out of there. But I mean, Josephina, man, she is such a like good job, girl. Good job. That's a story I hope you I guess I should say enjoyed it, but it was a rough one. So please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any new cases that I have. And thank you so much for your support. And please, friends, until next time, be safe. Bye bye.